Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. So let's talk about Ultimate Pro Wrestling, which is part of WWE's developmental program. So Ultimate Pro Wrestling was an organization that was started in El Segundo, California by Rick Bassman. Now, as we go into this, there's some things that need to be said up front. I found it very difficult to find when Ultimate Pro Wrestling actually got a developmental contract. Usually those things are pretty easy to find. It was very hard to find here. Rick Bassman, through interviews, has said that he had 2 different developmental deals with WWE. I was able to find a talent scout contract, which was essentially their developmental deal, which was in 2006. But they actually had sent people to WWE for years before that. So I don't know exactly when, but they have been affiliated with the WWE in some way or another for many, many years. So I have to give you the backstory, for starter, of the owner, Rick Bassman, and also going to give you some stories that come out of Ultimate Pro Wrestling. So, like I said, Ultimate Pro Wrestling was an organization founded by Rick Bassman in August of 1998 in El Segundo, California. They began an official relationship that I was able to find in WWE in 2006, but there was a lot of Ultimate Pro Wrestling performers that had already been signed by WWE much prior to 2006. So first we got to talk about Rick Bassman. Bassman is a very famous man for he found Sting in the Ultimate Warrior. So Rick Bassman, as how he got into the business from his own mouth, is that he was a fan as a child, and through the 1970s, he read wrestling magazines and was a fan of the LaBelle territory, which is the Los Angeles, Southern California territory before Vince McMahon came in, and that he was also a fan of DC Comics. And so in the 1980s, after he had become an entrepreneur and started multiple different businesses, he decided to get into the entertainment industry, which led him to working for Disney and doing some other things. So he says that he was inspired by Hulk Hogan and Hacksaw Jim Duggan to have all-American heroes. That's kind of what he liked. Again, as a guy who liked comic books and a guy who liked pro wrestling, he wanted to meld the two. But he didn't feel that Hulk Hogan and Jim Duggan and some of the other guys that were out there that existed at the time didn't fit what he believed was the appropriate vision for an all-American hero. So he had this idea to create this superhero team that was called the Power Team USA. First thing he wanted to do with Power Team USA is create an eclectic look. He wanted to have 4 men, all of them different. He wanted to have a multi-ethnic organization, sort of a black guy, a white guy, an Indian guy, etc. That was his original goal. So he set upon finding these guys in various places. He found 2 guys who were operating out of the Gold's Gym in California. Those 2 guys would be Steve Borton and Jim Hellwig. Then he found 2 security guards who worked, who were friends of his, Garland Donahoe and Mark Miller. And he brought all of these guys together, and he hired former pro wrestler Red Bastien to train them. And this was Power Team USA. At the time, he admitted that he didn't know much about the wrestling business. He thought he could just put guys together and sell them as a package. Ultimately, he was shopping around the Power Team USA concept, and only 2 of the 4 guys had any interest. Those 2 guys would be Steve Borton, who went on to become Sting, and Jim Hellwig, who went on to be the Ultimate Warrior. From this, Rick Bassman became pretty famous. He was a guy, of course, who found the Blade Runners, who would later become world champions in both WCW and the WWF at the exact same time. But he didn't stay in the wrestling business. Again, Rick Bassman is known as a hustler. He kept going on, kept making moves. And it wasn't until the 90s where he would actually rejoin the wrestling business. So in 1996, he started an MMA gym, which he believes is Southern California's first MMA gym, known as Extreme University. 2 years later, through Extreme University, he decided to open a wrestling school called Ultimate University. And Ultimate University was all about finding people who wanted to be pro wrestlers in the Southern California area, training them, and then ultimately selling them off to WWE or WCW or whoever he could at the time. The Ultimate University was the school. Okay, so he has a multiple tiered system that we'll get into later because it becomes very controversial, but we'll get into it in a minute. But the school itself was 250 $50 a month, and they worked on look, which means hitting the gym. Worked on promos. They worked on character development and different things like that. And the next year, Ultimate Pro Wrestling was born in El Segundo, California. He began running his own wrestling promotion. And he started from scratch. He hired his own trainers. He built his own rings. And he booked his own facilities, which was pretty much high schools and things like that. So here's a list of some of the trainers that trained at Ultimate Pro Wrestling throughout the years. It's, of course, very difficult to know who trained people, when, and where. So I'm just going to give you a list of people who I know trained at Ultimate Pro Wrestling. Tom Howard is actually one of the trainers of Ultimate Pro Wrestling. He was actually one of the co-owners of the promotion as well. Tom Howard is actually pretty well known as being the guy who trained Jack Black for the movie Nacho Libre. So Reggie Bennett was another one. Frankie Kazarian in some of the later years. Mike Bucci, who went on to become Nova and ECW, was a trainer at Ultimate Pro Wrestling. Joey Ryan in 2008 was a trainer at Ultimate Pro Wrestling. But probably the most famous trainer of Ultimate Pro Wrestling was actually Mad Dog Mike Bell. And if you don't know who Mad Dog Mike Bell is, I'm about to tell you, because Mad Dog Mike Bell is most famous for Perry Saturn throwing him on his head in 2001. On May the 12th, 2001, an episode of WWF Metal aired, which featured Perry Saturn versus local job guy Mike Bell. Mike Bell was a perennial jobber in the Northeast, where he was originally trained and was originally from. In this particular incident, he botched an arm drag in which he tossed Perry Saturn on his head. This led Perry Saturn to spaz out and beat the tar out of him. And this, of course, led to Perry Saturn losing his push and eventually being demoted to, he started doing the moppy gimmick. But Mike Bell also was one of the trainers for John Cena. So this guy is pretty famous. So speaking of John Cena, some of the people who went through Ultimate Pro Wrestling throughout its run was John Cena, who wrestled there as the prototype, Samoa Joe, Horseshoe, who went to WWE as Luther Reigns, Tara/Victoria, Chris Masters, who signed up to Ultimate Pro Wrestling at the age of 17, Mike the Miz Mizanin, Melina, who wrestled there as La Felina, Christopher Daniels, Paul London, Nathan Jones, and John Heidenreich. Those are just a couple of individuals. And in June 2000, 4 of Ultimate Pro Wrestling's guys were signed to developmental contracts. This would be Basil Bosnis, Justin McCulley, Aaron Aguilera, who went to WWE as Jesus, the bodyguard of Carlito, and John Cena. And that became like his most famous class. So another thing Rick Bassman is really known for is getting involved with the Hollywood industry. So UPW was the focus of at least 2 separate wrestling documentaries. One was from the Discovery Channel in the year 2000 on the inside of a pro wrestling school. In 2002, he did another documentary called Body Slam, the making of a professional wrestler, for the Learning Channel. He will also be involved in 2008 in the Celebrity Championship Wrestling boondoggle with Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff. Ended up being for CMT. And this was all very interesting. He's very well known to Bruce Pritchard and Jim Ross, and who had spent a lot of time out in California with him, choosing among his many recruits that he had picked up and trained. Now, according to Rick Bassman, he got a phone call from Bruce Pritchard at some point in 1999 or 2000 that WWF was going to do SmackDown, which was supposed to be an all-women's promotion. But of course, at some point, this ended up changing. But this is this is roughly the beginning of their WWE developmental contract. Rick Bassman said he had 2 developmental contracts, one under Jim Ross, which lasted for 2 years, and one under John Laurinaitis, which lasted for 1 year. From what I've been able to put together, the 1-year John Laurinaitis contract is likely the 2006 contract. So that is it. Ultimately, throughout the line of Ultimate Pro Wrestling, they sent at one point or another 43 different talent to the WWE, and he considered it to be the most successful training system for WWE in history. How many of those people became top guys? Not many, but he was able to get them out of California and into WWE. So Rick Bassman ended up being a very, very controversial figure. One of his most famous headaches was dealing with Jim Cornette. Jim Cornette throughout history has had many problems with Rick Bassman, and I'm going to list some of them, and I'm going to also list Rick Bassman's responses. So let's go through those. So one of the Jim Cornette's claims is that Rick Bassman focused on bodybuilders, that he did not look for people with any other athletic talent, and that much like Sting in The Ultimate Warrior, all he cared about was what people looked like. Rick Bassman's response to this was simply that he focused on what Vince McMahon wanted. Now, Vince McMahon seemed to like bodybuilders, and that was, the incentive was to find people with the look, and therefore that's what he did. The second claim Jim Cornette made was that he signed talent to management contracts, which gave him a share of their income in perpetuity. That it was sort of a management contract that was exorbitant. These type of things are pretty normal in wrestling. You've probably seen, if you've ever read a book, Billy Wolf and Fabulous Moolah would also have these kind of contracts where if they helped you get bookings, you have to kick back some of the money to them, to you, kind of as a talent agent. Rick Bassman was able to clear this up by saying that he did have management contracts under his management company. He did have a management company. And this is where we have to actually explain what was going on. So Rick Bassman had a parent company called Ultimate Industries. Under Ultimate Industries, there's 3 subsidiaries. There was Ultimate University, which was his wrestling school, Ultimate Pro Wrestling, which was the independent wrestling promotion, and Ultimate Management Group, and which is their consulting and negotiation and talent contracts. So according to Rick Bassman, he would sign guys to come to the promotion, or guys would come to the promotion. They pay tuition, and if they wanted help getting into WWE or somewhere else, they would have to sign a management contract. And then he laid out the management contracts. So according to Rick Bassman, the management contracts were for 2 years, and both it can only be extended if both parties agreed, and he was entitled to only 10% of, and which is pretty normal for management. And in some industries, it's as high as 15%. Then he says that he felt entitled to these management contracts, considering all the money he put into recruiting and training talent. And says that, hey, I had to do everything myself. I had to buy my own ring. I had to promote myself. I'm paying for the advertising. I'm paying for everything. So Aaron Aguilera, who wrestled in Ultimate Pro Wrestling, I believe that's Hardcore Kid, he had tried out for WWE multiple times and was never able to actually get in. He signed a management contract with Rick Bassman, and Rick Bassman put together a package of photos, video, various things like that, negotiated on his behalf, and was able to get him into WWE. So there are people who say whatever Rick Bassman was doing under his management contract, it actually worked. But of course, this was not the only time. He ultimately got into a lot of trouble, specifically with John Cena and with the Ultimate Warrior, over these contracts, because people didn't know that he also had Sting and the Ultimate Warrior under these management contracts as well, and was trying to extract money from them. He did say that Sting paid him later on when Sting made it big. Sting paid him, but Jim Hellwig, I don't believe, ever did. Now, there was an interview he had done with Wrestling Inc. I'm going to read his problems with John Cena, or John Cena's problems with him, verbatim from this piece of business. It says, I started John Cena at UPW. People always want to give me credit for discovering John Cena, but the truth is that John Cena discovered John Cena. He put the body together that he has, and he was either born with or developed the work ethic he has. Whether it had been at UPW or XYZ wrestling school, I think he ultimately would have found his way to WWE. But he found his way there through my system. It's the one that I personally and financially supported, so guys like John could have a place to get training and exposure and be put in front of people that could really bring his career to the next level. I did that for John, and for free, because at the time, he came to me and told me he didn't have the money to go to school. But I knew the guy would be a star. You didn't have to be a genius to see that he had all of the gifts and was positively going somewhere. The polar opposite of being appreciative about it, he's gone out of his way to bury me and hurt me ever since. It's boggled my mind. John and I were never buddies. We got along, but there are some guys from my company like Nova and Paul London that I will be friends with to the day I die. We are buddies, but John and I were never buddies. What happened was, immediately after leaving UPW, he went to OVW and Cornette, who absolutely hates me, even though I love him, not as a person, as I don't really know him. I love to simultaneously beat the shit out of him and sit down and go to dinner with him. But John got to OVW, and I've heard this from many people, that Cornette went to work on him, immediately said, "Don't let that piece of shit Bassman put his hand in your pocket. Don't pay him a penny. He's taking advantage of the boys. That's not how this works." So he got John Cena booked on a show called Manhunters. And then this is apparently another where him and John Cena cross paths. He says, "I was genuinely excited for John, and this is where people who are haters can choose to believe me or not. My favorite thing to do was to call people and give them good news. Yeah, I want to make my commission, believe it or not. I love to deliver good news. So I called John and said, 'John, deal's closed. We got you $40,000. He goes to me, "Don't spend that $4,000 in one place, Rick." It was so obnoxiously magnanimous. Here's a guy who just netted $36,000 and couldn't afford tuition a few months before. Right then, I thought this was weird. Anyway, John got to OVW, and back in the day, their average developmental deal then was $300 a week. That was a godsend back then, as the idea of paying wrestlers to train was a whole new thing. The other three deals were worth $300 a week. John's was $500 a week, and that was unusual for those times. But I went to work hard on Bruce Pritchard and Jim Ross, who ran talent relations. I told him he's going to be a star, and he has a work ethic that's second to none. So we got him $500 a week, and John paid me $50 commission for 3 or 4 weeks. The second he got to OVW, he sent me a one-line letter dismissing me as his manager. Ever since then, he's talked about me as shady and as a guy who takes advantage of the boys and puts his hands in their pockets rather. So there you go. But this was a big bone of contention for Jim Cornette, who thought that what Bassman was doing was unethical, and said that he often got lawyers involved to break these contracts, so Bassman couldn't continue to make money off of these people. And the reason Jim Cornette would know this, for people who don't know, is that ultimately, if WWE signed somebody from Ultimate Pro Wrestling, they would probably send them to Deep South, or send them to Heartland, or send them to Ohio Valley Wrestling. So it was like Ultimate Pro Wrestling would be like your first stop. Then you would sign to WWE, and then they would send you somewhere else. So Jim Cornette was able to get quite a few of the guys that Rick Bassman had picked up and trained and scouted. And he was breaking these contracts. And Rick Bassman says, "Hey, that's tortious interference. I could sue you." But that would, of course, damage my relationship with WWE, because Jim Cornette at the time was working for WWE as a developmental trainer and all that sort of stuff. So he decided not to do it. But Jim Cornette also claimed Rick Bassman was falsely advertising as a WWE developmental program, and that he was not a part of the developmental program, and that it was simply 2 or 3 schools at the time, of which Ultimate Pro Wrestling was not one. Again, I was not able to disprove this independently. Rick Bassman says, of course, that it was not true, and that he had been signed to a developmental program under Jim Ross. I wasn't able to find anything that says that's true, so I have to take his word for it. But I did find that they were signed to a talent agreement in 2006. They were able to sign. They were the official talent scout of the WWF in Southern California. They also, Rick Bassman was known for getting talent from the WWF, like Undertaker to work his shows, Triple H to work his shows in these small arenas in California in order to help him out. So he had some type of relationship with the WWE, but it's relatively unknown what it is. In 2006, this one was made public, but this was already after Jim Cornette had been fired from Ohio Valley Wrestling. So according to Rick Bassman, he was okayed by WWE Legal to use WWE Developmental in his advertising. Now, a big bone of contention between Jim Cornette and Rick Bassman came from Jim Cornette saying that Rick Bassman was attempting to steal their Six Flags. The Six Flags events were pretty big events for Ohio Valley Wrestling, and that Rick Bassman was actually trying to run counter to them. He claimed to have called WWE and to discuss this and to threaten Rick Bassman to kick his ass if kept advertising outside of his territory. Now, Rick Bassman claims that he hired a third-party agency to handle the advertising and that he had nothing to do with it. And that, he's a professional. He hires other professionals to do their thing. And that he went to an agency who started sending these flyers all over the country, one of which was Six Flags in Louisville, which is the home of Ohio Valley Wrestling, and that he was not trying to push into OVW territory. And that it just happened that a third-party agency that he was paying advertised in that area. Now, of course, Ultimate Pro Wrestling, I don't believe, ever ran anywhere near Louisville. It was just an accident. Ohio Valley Wrestling had a contract with Six Flags anyway, and they couldn't break it. It was, pretty exclusive. So it was no harm, no foul, but, Jim Cornette's a hothead, so that really pissed him off. And number 5 was, as far as Jim Cornette's complaints about Rick Bassman, is the most obvious one, that Rick Bassman has exposed the business by participating in documentaries that expose the business of pro wrestling. Rick Bassman, of course, argued with this one in the most common sense way possible, that the business was already exposed, and that he tried to tastefully engage with these documentaries, and that he often showed the work that was actually necessary to become a pro wrestler. They did not make fun of the business, and they did, and they wanted to show the dedication that it takes to become a pro wrestler. So Jim Cornette and Rick Bassman probably would never get along. Another famous Ultimate Pro Wrestling thing that probably needs to be well known is they actually worked together with Roddy Piper in 2003 on a 5-day wrestling camp. So this was also, another interesting thing with Ultimate Pro Wrestling. So Rick Bassman is no longer the head of Ultimate Pro Wrestling. I'm not sure if it's still if it's still running or not. But for years, they had their own DVDs, and they did pretty well. And like Rick Bassman often touts the 43 talent that he sent to WWE. 2 of which, of course, being The Miz and John Cena, being really, really top stars to the point where they main event at WrestleMania. So the Ultimate Pro Wrestling had some undeniable success, and it did very well. So Rick Bassman is, should be more well known as far as pro wrestling is concerned. So there it is, Ultimate Pro Wrestling, the story of. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you guys for your time, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Tell me what's worse than learning all that you led to believe was all horse crap. They distort, so question as